Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was a quiet evening, one of those nights where the usual bustle of the city seemed to hush itself under a thin veil of fog, the kind of fog that wraps around you like a blanket, making everything seem distant, blurry, even unreal. I had been walking for what felt like hours, just drifting through the misty streets, lost in my thoughts. My feet carried me down familiar roads, but tonight they felt like they were taking me somewhere different, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere I couldn't quite place. I had recently picked up an old map at a bookstore, a crumpled yellowed thing that had clearly seen better days. I didn't know why I was drawn to it, but something about the faded lines and forgotten landmarks called to me. I didn't need it for any particular reason, but I liked the idea of following an old map, letting it guide me through places I'd never noticed before, as though there was a story hidden in the cracks of the city's streets. I started with a few casual turns following the streets marked on the map, amused by the way the old cartographer had mapped out the neighborhood. I was used to the layout of the area, having walked these streets for years, but there was something oddly comforting about tracing the map's winding lines and imagining how things might have looked decades ago. But as I continued walking, I began to notice something. The streets weren't matching up, not exactly. The names were the same, but the shapes of the blocks, the angles of the intersections, they were different from what I knew. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe the map was older than I thought. A relic from a time before the city had grown and changed. Still, the further I walked, the more I felt something shifting beneath my feet. The buildings I passed seemed to have a strange, faded quality to them, as though they were caught somewhere between the present and the past. Some of the windows were cracked, the paint chipped, as though time had slowly begun to erode the once pristine structures. It wasn't until I came to the end of one street that things really began to feel wrong. According to the map, this was where I was supposed to turn, but as I stood at the corner, I found myself staring at something I didn't expect, a large faded sign reading "Dead End." I looked up and down the street. There was no sign of any road continuing. Just a solid wall of brick, covered in layers of ivy and moss. The fog wrapped itself around the edges of the street, making everything feel suffocatingly close. But this didn't make sense. I had followed the map exactly. It was supposed to continue. I pulled the map from my pocket, staring at the markings. The street was supposed to keep going. There were no dead ends here, no barriers. The map showed a continuation of the road, one that curved gently to the right and led to a familiar square. But here I was standing at the supposed end, and the road simply stopped. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of it, my mind spinning. Maybe I had missed something, a hidden path, a small opening in the wall. I stepped closer, my feet dragging against the wet pavement, my breath fogging. In the cold night air, I reached out and placed my hand against the brick wall, and then the strangest thing happened. The road didn't stop. The wall, which had appeared so solid moments before, shifted slightly, as if it had been an illusion all along. It opened just a crack, enough for me to slip through. The fog seemed to press in even tighter around me, and the temperature dropped. I took a tentative step forward, wondering if I had somehow triggered some hidden passage. The air felt heavier here, like I was crossing into a space that didn't quite belong to this world. The street stretched out before me, just as it had on the map. It curved exactly as the old map had indicated, but what struck me most was the quiet. It was absolute. The usual hum of the city, the distant sounds of cars or people had vanished entirely. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own breath, quick and shallow. As I walked along the road that didn't stop, I couldn't help but glance back, but the wall behind me had already closed. I couldn't see the dead-end sign anymore. All that was left was the empty street stretching out before me, drawing me in. The fog had grown thicker, curling around my ankles like a living thing, urging me to continue, and so I did. The road wound its way around old buildings that seemed to flicker in and out of focus, like they were out of time. Some of them looked abandoned, with windows boarded up and doors left ajar, but I didn't dare enter them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here, that I had somehow crossed into a forgotten place, a stretch of road that wasn't meant for anyone to walk. I turned another corner, my steps echoing loudly in the thick silence, but as I moved I began to notice something even stranger. The map, which had been so detailed, so clear before, was now fading in my hands. The ink was smudging, the lines becoming blurry. The familiar streets I had followed seemed to twist and blur into something unfamiliar. The more I walked, the more the map seemed to warp its details, unraveling like threads of a dream I couldn't hold on to. And still the road stretched ahead of me. I didn't stop to look back anymore. The street didn't feel like part of the world. I knew it felt like something else, something old, something forgotten. There was no turning back now. The fog, the street, the map, it all had a weight to it. A heaviness that pressed on my chest. Every step I took felt as though I was moving further from reality, slipping deeper into something I couldn't comprehend. Eventually I found myself at another crossroads, an intersection I didn't recognize. The fog was so thick now that I could barely make out the buildings, only their silhouettes against the dim light. But what struck me most was the sign at the corner, a sign I hadn't seen before, one that hadn't been on the map. It said, "The road never ends." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how to leave, how to turn back. I couldn't even remember how I had gotten here anymore. The city that I had once known felt so far away now, and the road beneath my feet felt endless, stretching on and on into the fog. I folded the map, now barely legible, and stuffed it into my pocket, feeling as if I were holding on to something much more than paper. I wasn't sure what I was chasing anymore, but there was no way out. The street was still ahead of me, still leading me somewhere I couldn't see, somewhere I couldn't reach, and no matter how far I walked, I knew the street would never stop. I was walking home that evening, the kind of night where the air feels crisp against your skin, but it's still warm enough to make you forget the chill. The streetlights flickered in their usual pattern, casting long shadows across the road, and the distant sound of traffic hummed through the stillness. It had been a long day, and I was ready to collapse into the comfort of my bed. My mind was elsewhere, drifting between thoughts of work, errands, and the kind of mundane things that fill up an ordinary life. The sidewalk was familiar, almost like a second skin. I've walked this route hundreds of times, and each step seemed to carry its own rhythm, one that was as natural as breathing. As I crossed the street, I didn't expect anything unusual. There was a woman ahead of me, walking briskly, her heels clicking on the pavement in the quiet night. She was dressed in a long coat, dark hair flowing down her back, and her pace was quick, like she had somewhere to be. I didn't pay much attention to her at first, lost in my own thoughts, but then she reached the corner ahead, just as I was about to cross, and without breaking stride, she stepped off the curb and crossed the road in front of me. She moved with a purpose, her steps measured, but not hurried. I continued walking, keeping an eye on her as she reached the other side. That's when I noticed something strange. I hadn't seen her cross. She hadn't turned at the corner or disappeared down an alley. No, she had simply crossed the street and ended up right back where she started, on the same side as me, just a few paces ahead. It wasn't possible. There was no way she had retraced her steps that quickly, yet there she was still, Walking as if nothing had happened, I stopped for a moment. Watching her, maybe she had turned around, I thought, or maybe she had just crossed in a different spot. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but something about her sudden reappearance made me feel uneasy. The street was empty, save for the two of us. But it felt wrong, almost like she wasn't supposed to be here, or that she had crossed some invisible line that didn't belong to her. I kept walking, trying to dismiss the feeling that had settled into my chest. I wasn't a superstitious person, nor did I believe in coincidences that bordered on the strange, but as I neared her, I couldn't shake the thought that something was off. She hadn't looked at me, hadn't acknowledged my presence at all. Her steps remained steady, her gaze fixed ahead, never wavering. But then, as I passed her, something strange happened. I caught a glimpse of her face, and that's when it hit me. I recognized her. I didn't know where from, but I knew her face. Her features were familiar, like a long-lost memory, trying to resurface. It was unsettling, like a dream, where everything feels just out of reach, yet you can't shake the feeling that you've lived it before. Her eyes, those deep dark eyes, seemed to pierce through me for a moment, and I felt a strange wave of déjà vu wash over me. It was like I had seen this woman somewhere else, maybe years ago, or in a different time. But the memory remained just out of my grasp. I glanced back over my shoulder, thinking she might have noticed me, but no, she was still walking ahead. Her figure growing smaller in the distance, she didn't look back. I hurried my pace, the strange sensation still clinging to me like a shadow, and I tried to put it out of my mind, but as I continued down the street I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, light and measured, almost exactly matching my own stride. It felt like she was still there, even though I hadn't heard her footsteps. When I looked back, the sound was too subtle, too quiet. Like someone was walking just out of earshot, but never too far away. I glanced around, trying to locate the source of the sound. The street was as empty as ever, with only the dim light of the street lamps casting long shadows. There was no one else around, and yet I felt that subtle presence, the feeling of someone just behind me, as though they were mirroring my every movement. I stopped again, this time turning to look directly behind me. There she was, the woman, but now she was right there, standing only a few feet away, as if she had appeared out of thin air. Her coat swayed slightly in the breeze, and her gaze was fixed on me, unreadable. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I froze. She hadn't been there a moment ago, had she? She couldn't have. She had been ahead of me crossing the road, but somehow, here she was right behind me, like she had always been. There I opened my mouth to say something, to ask her why she was following me, but no words came out. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none made sense. I took a step backward, instinctively putting some space between us. But as I did, she took one step forward, keeping the same distance. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, followed my every move. "Do you know me?" I asked, the question slipping from my lips before I could stop it. My voice sounded strange in the quiet, as if the very air had shifted around us. She didn't answer. She'd simply tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this question all along, but just as quickly it was gone. I turned to leave, shaking off the unsettling feeling, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard it again. The soft click of her heels behind me, perfectly in sync with my own footsteps. It was the same sound, the same rhythm, like we were moving together, yet apart. It was impossible to ignore now. My pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't dare look back again. I kept walking faster, now my breath shallow, trying to outrun the feeling that had gripped me. I turned a corner, but when I looked ahead there, she was once again standing at the intersection, waiting for me, as if she had never left. My heart sank. I crossed the road again, away from her, trying to escape, but she followed, always a step behind, always just close enough to make me feel the weight of her presence. No matter how fast I walked, no matter how many turns I made, she was always there, right beside me. I don't know how long it went on. Maybe I ran, maybe I walked, but it didn't matter. She never broke stride. She never slowed down, and now as I reflect on that night, I realize no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I never truly left her behind. It was one of those nights that felt strangely calm, the kind where everything seemed suspended in a deep, heavy quiet. The city was still just enough to make the occasional sound stand out: the distant hum of traffic, the faint rustling of leaves, the soft tap of my shoes against the pavement. I had been walking for hours, wandering without any real destination, just letting the cool night air clear my head. It had been a rough week, and something about walking in the quiet dark felt comforting. Almost like I could forget for a little while. The street I was on was familiar enough, though I had never really paid much attention to it before. It wasn't the kind of place that stood out, not part of the bustling areas, but more of a quiet stretch of old buildings and overgrown trees. The street lamps above me cast long shadows, stretching like thin, broken fingers across the sidewalk. The night was cool, but not cold, and everything seemed to fall into a peaceful rhythm. As I walked, my eyes wandered up to one of the street lamps. The glow from the light was soft and yellow, like a lingering memory of warmth, and for a moment it felt like I could just keep walking, never stopping, letting the hours slip by. But then something caught my eye, something I couldn't quite make sense of. Hanging from the street lamp, just a few feet above me, was a pair of shoes. At first I thought it was nothing, a trick of the light or some strange coincidence, but as I drew closer, the shoes became clearer. They were mine, the same pair of shoes I had been wearing all evening, the ones that I had on my feet just moments ago. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I could feel a rush of confusion flood over me. How were they hanging there? They looked like they had been tossed over the lamp, one shoe laced through the other, as if someone had carelessly thrown them up there. But no one was around. There was no one on the street. No one had seen me walk by. No one had even passed in the time I had been out here. The longer I stared at the shoes, the more the world seemed to press in on me, the air feeling thick and suffocating. I tried to shake it off, but the unease in my chest only grew. It was just too wrong. I had been wearing those shoes just a few minutes ago, hadn't I? How could they be up there hanging from the light without anyone putting them there? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my feet frozen to the pavement. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shoes. I felt a strange impulse to look around, to check if someone was playing a prank on me, but there was nothing. No movement. Just the faint hum of the street lamp, and the silence that had begun to feel deafening. I stepped closer, my heart thumping harder. Now, almost painfully, I reached up, not sure what I was expecting. Maybe I thought if I touched them, if I grabbed them, I would understand. But as my hand neared the shoes, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, a chill running through me. It wasn't cold. Not exactly, but something about the air around the street lamp felt off. It was as if the light itself was dimming, flickering, casting the entire scene in a shadow that didn't belong. I reached up and grabbed the shoes, pulling them down with an uneasy tug. The fabric felt unnervingly soft in my hands, almost too light, like I was holding something I shouldn't have been, something I didn't understand. I stood there for a moment, holding them still, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What was happening, and then I felt it, a whisper, faint, so faint that at first I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but it was there in the air, brushing against my ear like a cool breeze. "Why did you leave them?" The voice was soft, almost comforting, but it carried a weight, a sadness that made my blood run cold. My grip tightened on the shoes, my heart racing. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, someone who had been watching. But there was no one, just the street, the empty sidewalk, and the distant hum of the city that felt a million miles away. I looked down at the shoes in my hands, the familiar shape of them now seeming strange, almost alien. I couldn't make sense of it. Hadn't I been wearing them? Hadn't I? I took a step back, my mind swirling with confusion. The air seemed to thicken around me, pressing down with a quiet pressure, and I realized then how deeply I was unsettled. The whisper still lingered in my ears, echoing through the quiet street. "Why did you leave them?" The street lamp above me flickered again, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pooling at my feet like ink. I felt a chill run down my spine, and suddenly I wasn't sure if I had been walking down the street for minutes or hours. Time had become fluid, like I was slipping in and out of reality. I could feel the weight of the shoes in my hands, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten them, how they had ended up in my grasp. Something wasn't right. I felt it in every fiber of my being. I looked down at the shoes again. They were mine, weren't they? The same worn leather, the same scuff marks, but they were different now. They were too light, too soft, too familiar. It was like I had touched something I shouldn't have, like I had crossed into a place where rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. I glanced around once more, but the street remained still, empty. No one had seen anything. No one had seen me take the shoes down, or even noticed when they had first appeared there hanging from the lamp. I couldn't stay here any longer. I didn't know what I was waiting for, what I was expecting to find, but I knew I couldn't keep standing there clutching those shoes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something wrong, that somehow I had become a part of something I couldn't escape. So I turned and began walking away, not looking back. I could feel the shoes in my hands, still unnervingly light, still too soft, and I couldn't shake the whisper echoing in my head. "Why did you leave them?" The night stretched out before me, dark and endless, and I kept walking. But the air still felt heavy, as if the city itself was watching, waiting. It was one of those evenings where the world seems to slow down just a little, as if the entire city is holding its breath. The streets were damp from the rain that had passed earlier, and the lights from the shop windows gleamed softly on the wet pavement. I was walking home, the quiet hum of the city mixing with the occasional car driving by, but everything felt a little off. Nothing specific, just a sense that something wasn't quite right. But I was tired. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to get home and forget about everything. I had walked down this street hundreds of times. It was my usual route, a quiet residential road that connected the main street to my apartment. Familiar, comfortable. I knew every crack in the pavement, every pothole that made walking in the dark a bit of a challenge. There was something soothing about the predictability of it all. The houses on either side were always the same, neatly trimmed lawns, a few porch lights flickering on the soft glow of living rooms visible through the windows. It was the kind of street you'd barely notice unless you were looking for it, but that night, I did notice it. As I walked, I began to notice the pavement beneath my feet, in a way I never had before. The cracks in the sidewalk, the small divots from years of wear, the pattern of the cobblestones, they all felt too familiar. It was almost as if they were reaching out to me, calling for my attention in a way that was unsettling. I couldn't shake the Feeling that the world around me was stretching, pulling me into a place I had no desire to be, I paused for a moment, standing still in the middle of the cold sidewalk. The usual sounds of the street had dulled, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the soft tapping of my shoes against the wet ground. I looked down, focusing on the pavement, as though searching for something I couldn't quite put into words, and that's when I noticed it, my footprints. At first I thought it was nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe the way my shoes had left an impression in the wet concrete. But as I took another step, I looked down again. The imprint of my foot in the puddle of water was strange. It wasn't quite the right shape. The arch of my foot was wrong, the curve of my toes off by a fraction, the heel too high, as though someone else had walked in my place. I stopped again. Confused, looking at my feet, I shifted my weight, stepping back and forth, trying to understand what I was seeing. My own footprints should have matched me, should have looked just like the shape of my foot, but they didn't. They were wrong, they were different. A cold feeling crept down my spine, and I quickly moved forward, my eyes fixed on the pavement beneath me. Each step seemed to deepen my unease. The next set of prints in the puddle were just as strange, not quite mine. There was something unsettling about the way the water rippled around them, as if the reflection of my foot wasn't quite reflecting me. I walked faster, desperate to get home, but the further I went, the more the feeling grew. Each step I took, each imprint in the water seemed more and more out of sync. I tried to ignore it too, convinced myself it was just fatigue that I was imagining it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And then, as I walked past a streetlight, something caught my eye, a shadow moving just a little too fluidly, just a little too perfectly. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. The street was empty. No one was around yet. The shadow lingered in the corner of my mind, making my stomach tighten. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps echoing louder now, almost too loud, as though the night had grown too quiet. The familiar houses, the same street, the same pavement, they were all starting to look foreign, distorted, in a way I couldn't quite describe. I reached the corner of the street, where the familiar curve of the sidewalk led me toward home. But the moment I turned the corner, I froze. The street stretched out before me, just as it always did, but the pavement, it was wrong. The patterns of the cracks in the sidewalk were different. The cobblestones were arranged in ways I didn't recognize. I stood there staring at the street, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to figure out how this was possible. This wasn't the road I had just walked down. It couldn't be. I retraced my steps, moving back to where I had turned, but everything had changed. The pavement, the houses, the way the shadows stretched across the ground. It was all wrong. I felt dizzy, like I was in a dream. I could still see the faint impressions of my footprints in the wet pavement, but now they seemed to have led me here, to this place I didn't recognize. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me watching me, but the street was empty, silent as it always had been. But something was different now. Something had shifted, and I couldn't quite understand what it was. I started walking again, slower. This time my eyes scanning the road, looking for something familiar, anything that would tell me I was still in the world I knew. But the more I walked, the more I realized the road was the same, but it had also changed. The pavement was familiar, but the cracks didn't match my memory. The shadows, the light, the way the world seemed to stretch out before me, it all felt wrong. I glanced down at my feet once more. The next set of footprints I left behind, they were even stranger than before. They didn't look like mine at all now. The shape was all wrong, the edges jagged, as though the prints weren't even made by human feet. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The pavement, the street, the houses, they were all slipping away from me, becoming something else. I was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't place, and the more I tried to understand it, the more confused I became. I looked back at the street, but it was the same street I had always known. The pavement was the same, the cracks, the puddles, everything was the same, except now I realized my footprints didn't match me. They never had, and the longer I stood there, the more I understood I wasn't in the place I had thought. This wasn't the road I had walked, this wasn't my street anymore. And no matter how many times I retraced my steps, I knew deep down that I was lost in a place where even my own footprints didn't belong. The evening had settled into that strange quiet dusk where the world feels slightly off, as though it's holding its breath before the night fully takes hold. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by, casting long fleeting shadows against the houses. I was walking through the neighborhood, my feet dragging slightly from the long day, when I noticed her. She was standing in front of a house I had passed countless times before. The house was old, unkempt, with peeling paint, and a yard that had long since fallen into disrepair. The windows were foggy, the door sagging on its hinges, a place that had been forgotten by everyone, including the people who once called it home for years. I'd watched the house stand there untouched, but I never thought much about it. No one ever seemed to go in or out, but she was there now, standing on the front steps, her hand poised above the old brass doorknob. She was tall, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back, wearing a pale blue coat that almost blended into the night. I could barely make out her face, but there was something about her, a stillness, a silence that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. I stopped walking, drawn to her for reasons I couldn't explain. She wasn't doing anything overtly strange, but there was a quiet intensity about her, like she was waiting for something or someone. I watched her for a moment longer, unsure if I should approach, but before I could make a decision, she knocked. It was a sharp, deliberate sound, the knuckles of her hands striking the door with a rhythm that seemed to practiced too sure. The sound echoed through the night, reverberating in my chest. I expected nothing to happen, expected the house to remain silent and dark, just as it always had. But then something did happen. The door creaked just a little, as if something inside had shifted. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I glanced at the street, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. No one else was watching her. No one else was there. She knocked again. This time the door opened slightly, just enough to make the rusted hinges groan. A crack of darkness was all I could see from where I stood, but I could feel a shift in the air, as though the house itself had inhaled deeply. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground, and the strangest thing occurred. I couldn't bring myself to look away. It was as if some unseen force was pulling my gaze back to her, to that door. I watched her push it open just a fraction more. Her hand didn't seem to tremble, and her face remained serene. It was as though she knew something I didn't, as though this moment was part of something inevitable. And then she stepped inside. For a long moment, everything was still. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The sounds of the distant city faded into nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood frozen in place. It was like time had bent, stretching out in the quiet, and I was stuck, caught in a moment I couldn't fully understand, but I knew that something was wrong. That house had been abandoned for decades, untouched by anything living. The windows had long been boarded up. There hadn't been anyone in that house in as long as I could remember. I had walked by it so many times, and it had always been silent, as if the world had forgotten about it, forgotten about whatever it used to be. And yet here she was, stepping into the darkness of a place that hadn't seen life in so long. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind scrambling for explanations. My feet felt heavy like they were weighed down by some invisible force, and I couldn't move. I felt the instinct to walk toward her, to call out to her, but the words wouldn't come. There was something wrong about approaching that house, something ancient and unspoken, something that whispered in the stillness of the air around me. I took a hesitant step forward, and then suddenly, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it echoed through the empty street, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Don't come in." I froze. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was as though it had come from inside the house, yet it wasn't a voice I recognized. It had the same echoing, hollow quality of someone who had been lost, forgotten, buried by time. I took another step forward, my curiosity outweighing the unsettling feeling in my gut, but as I approached the door I stopped. The space between us seemed to stretch out again, as if the house itself was pushing me back. The door creaked again, this time with a sharp, agonizing sound, and the darkness inside seemed to deepen. I could feel it now, the weight of the years, the weight of abandonment that had settled into the very bones of the house. The air smelled old, musty, like dust and decay, and something cold brushed against my skin, making my fingers tingle. I reached out my hand, trembling, and touched the edge of the door. It was warm, a warmth that didn't belong, a warmth that made my stomach turn. I pulled my hand back quickly, but something inside me pushed me forward. Again my feet moved on their own, and I stepped into the doorway, crossing the threshold into the house. The moment I did, everything shifted. The temperature dropped. The air became thick, as though I had walked into a place that had been frozen in time. I stepped further inside, my heart thudding in my chest, and I noticed the strange silence around me. The house seemed endless, stretching far beyond what I had seen from the outside. The hallways were narrow, dimly lit by light that seemed to come from nowhere. And then I saw her again. She was standing at the end of a long corridor, her back turned to me. The eerie stillness hung heavy in the air, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to call out to her, ask her what she was doing here, but something held me back. Something in the house, in the way it felt, kept me silent. I took a step toward her, and the floor beneath me groaned. She turned, then slowly, her face unreadable, her expression somehow both familiar and foreign. But it wasn't her face that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection in her eyes, the empty, hollow gaze that looked back at me, as though she had been waiting for me to come inside, as though she had always been waiting. I turned to leave, but the door I had entered through was gone. The hallway stretched out before me, endless and dim. I was trapped with nowhere to go but deeper into the darkness of the house. And then I realized the truth. The house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting, waiting for me, waiting for anyone to cross its threshold, to step into its forgotten rooms, to feel the weight of the years press in from all sides. And when I tried to leave, I knew the house would never let me go. It started on a typical autumn evening, the kind of night where the air feels crisp, and the world seems quieter, softened by the faint rustle of fallen leaves scattered across the sidewalk. I had finished a late dinner with friends and was walking home, a familiar route that I'd taken countless times before. The streets were relatively empty, save for the occasional passing car and the distant sound of city life winding down for the night. It wasn't that I was lost. I knew the way home, every turn, every familiar corner, but that night something felt different. As I walked, the streetlights ahead of me flickered intermittently, as if the city itself were tired just like me. I could see the faint glow of the next streetlight in the distance, but as I drew closer I noticed something odd. The light didn't seem to stay where it was supposed to. It wasn't a dramatic shift, nothing too obvious. At first it just felt like the light was always a few steps ahead of me, just beyond reach, teasing me with its warm glow. I brushed it off as exhaustion at first. After all, I'd been on my feet all day, but the further I walked, the more persistent it became. The streetlight I had been heading toward was still just out of reach. I quickened my pace, eager to catch up, but when I got there, it wasn't where I thought it would be. It was a few steps farther down the road, always out of my immediate grasp, almost like it was deliberately leading me somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. I stopped for a moment, staring at the glow in the distance. I felt uneasy, though I couldn't quite explain why. The air was heavy, the usual noise of the city now muffled, as if everything had been turned down. The shadows from the trees stretched out across the pavement, and the night felt colder than it had when I started my walk, but the streetlight glowing softly ahead beckoned me. I shrugged off the strange sensation. Just tired, I muttered to myself. I had no reason to be afraid. I was just walking home, so I resumed my pace, only to find the same thing happen again. As I drew near the next streetlight, it too seemed to move away from me, just a little farther down the road. My mind was racing now, questions flickering like quicksilver in my thoughts. What was happening? Why were the lights moving this time? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stopped looking back down the street, expecting to see the lights behind me, but the scene before me was unchanged. The light ahead of me remained in its place, and the streets seemed as ordinary as they always did. If only I could reach them. I took a deep breath, hoping to calm myself. This couldn't be real, could it? Perhaps it was some kind of trick my eyes were playing on me. I turned around, intending to retrace my steps and head in the other direction, but the lights there were behaving the same way too. I found myself following one streetlight after another, each one just out of reach, as though they were deliberately keeping me on a path that never quite led anywhere. The distance between them seemed to stretch, pulling me into a loop I couldn't break. Each time I thought I had reached the next light, I'd find it had somehow moved farther, like I was stuck in an invisible maze. There was no end to it. The farther I walked, the more I began to feel as though the streetlights themselves were changing their positions on purpose, guiding me in endless circles. The streets, once so familiar, now felt foreign, warped by some unseen hand. My heart began to race. I turned back again, but the streets didn't feel the same anymore. It was as if the city had somehow shifted, restructured itself while I wasn't looking. The buildings, the sidewalks, the lights, they all felt unfamiliar, distorted, and yet I knew these were the same streets I had walked down hundreds of times. I had walked them in daylight, I had walked them at night, like I was now, but now under the dull glow of the streetlights they felt different, hollow, disorienting. I tried to remember my way, tried to focus on something concrete. A corner I passed, a store I knew was up ahead, but no matter how I turned, the lights always led me back to the same place, circling in on themselves. Every step I took, every turn brought me right back to where I started. The air grew thicker, colder, and my footsteps echoed louder in the silence of the night, amplifying the eerie feeling creeping into my chest. I wanted to scream out to break the silence, but my voice felt stuck in my throat, suffocated by the growing dread. I was trapped in a loop, following the same lights, the same empty streets, over and over, with no way out. My thoughts started to spiral. Was this some kind of dream? Had I fallen asleep and imagined all of this, or was I stuck in a different version of reality, where the rules of space and time didn't apply? The streets should have led me home, but the more I tried to make sense of the situation, the more the lights seemed to push me further into confusion. The streetlights ahead of me were no longer just light fixtures. They had become like beacons, drawing me deeper into the maze, keeping me in motion, keeping me from stopping. I tried looking away, tried closing my eyes, but the image of the lights was burned into my mind. They were always there, just ahead, and I had to follow them. I had to. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes, hours, time had begun to lose all meaning. Eventually exhaustion crept in, and I stopped standing. In the middle of the street, I couldn't take another step. I had to make it stop. I stood in the stillness, listening to the soft hum of the lights, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but the lights didn't stop. They kept blinking, flickering, as if mocking me. And then from somewhere distant, the first sound I had heard in what felt like forever, a faint low hum, as if the lights themselves were communicating with each other. My body tensed, my pulse racing, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Suddenly, a break in the darkness. A figure emerged, walking toward me. In the glow of the streetlights, I felt a jolt of relief, but the feeling quickly turned to unease as the figure got closer. The more I looked at them, the more I realized I couldn't see their face. It was a blur, like a mirage, a distortion I couldn't focus on. I didn't want to wait to find out who it was. I turned and ran, but the lights were there again, right in front of me, stretching farther than I thought possible, leading me down a path that looped endlessly around me. And I realized then that the lights weren't leading me home. They were leading me somewhere else, somewhere I didn't want to be, somewhere I was trapped, stuck in a circle of light and shadow that refused to let me go. I don't know how much longer I'll keep walking. I don't know if the circle will ever end. It was one of those late afternoons, when the day lingers in a kind of half-light caught between the fading warmth of the sun and the coolness of the evening that's slowly creeping in. I was walking home from work, taking the long route as I often did to clear my head after a long, tiring day. The city streets were starting to empty out, the bustle giving way to quiet, and I found comfort in the solitude. It's always in these moments that the streets feel like they belong to me, like I can step out of the world and into something more personal, more private. I had always passed by the alley without thinking much of it. It was just a narrow, unremarkable passage between two old buildings, the kind you could easily overlook if you weren't paying attention. But that evening something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the way the dim light filtered through the narrow space between the buildings, casting long, strange shadows on the pavement. Maybe it was the way the air seemed different there, a little cooler, a little more still, like the alley was holding its breath. I don't know what it was, but for some reason I found myself stepping toward it, drawn by a quiet curiosity. I couldn't shake the moment I stepped into the alley. The world outside seemed to fade. The noise of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the murmurs of people walking by, was swallowed up by the thick silence of the narrow space. The walls on either side of me were taller than I remembered, the old brick rising up, dark and uneven. A faint smell of dampness and decay lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of old wood. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unfamiliar, and that alone made me pause for a moment. I continued walking, feeling the cool, slightly gritty stone beneath my shoes. The alley seemed longer than I remembered, stretching further than I thought it should. But then alleys often have that illusion of depth, don't they? They seem to go on forever, even when they're just a few steps long. It was quiet, too quiet, and the shadows cast by the buildings felt unnervingly still, as though they were waiting. The path was straight, but something about it made me uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I moved forward, trying to shake the discomfort, my thoughts turned to mundane things: dinner, laundry, the things I still had to do before the day ended. But the feeling didn't fade. The alley had a strange quality to it, a sense of unreality, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't quite part of the world I knew. I glanced back, half expecting to see the street where I had come from, but the entrance was already hidden, swallowed up by the thickening shadows. It was as though the alley had closed behind me. I kept walking, telling myself I was being silly. This was just another part of the city. There was nothing wrong here, nothing out of place. But then, as I rounded a slight bend in the alley, I stopped ahead of me. Where the alley should have ended, there was nothing but a blank wall. It wasn't a dead end, it was just wrong. The wall was too tall, too smooth, the kind of thing you never see in an alley. And the strangest part was the texture. It wasn't brick or concrete, but something that looked like old wood, weathered and worn, like the remnants of something long abandoned. I stepped forward, trying to inspect it, my heart suddenly racing. The surface was rough, but there were no windows, no doors, nothing that would explain why the alley ended so abruptly. I reached out, running my fingers over the wood, and I felt something I couldn't explain. The wall seemed to shift beneath my touch, just slightly, like it was alive. My hand recoiled as if stung, and then I heard it, a soft creaking noise, almost imperceptible, like a door opening in the distance. I turned quickly, expecting to see something, someone, but there was no one. Just the silent alley stretching behind me, or what should have been behind me. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. It felt as if the alley had changed while I wasn't looking, like it had shifted in some imperceptible way, rearranging itself without me noticing. And that's when I realized I wasn't where I had come from. The alley had altered itself. I turned around, but when I looked back, everything felt off. The walls on either side of me seemed closer now, the space between them narrower. It was as if the alley had closed in on me, leaving me with no choice but to keep moving forward. The feeling of unease grew in my chest, a tightness that spread through my limbs, but I had no choice. I kept walking. As I moved, the alley seemed to stretch out before me, again longer than it should have been, the shadows growing thicker, darker. The walls felt oppressive, the air heavier with each step I took. I glanced around, looking for something familiar, the street, the buildings, anything that could remind me of where I was, but there was nothing. It felt like I was trapped in some other place, a version of the city that didn't quite match the one I had known. I kept walking, unable to stop, unable to turn back. The alley was straight, just as I remembered, but every step I took felt like I was walking further into the unknown. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I reached the end, or at least what I thought was the end. I stopped short, my heart leaping in my chest. The alley had changed again now. Instead of the blank wall, I saw the familiar street sign, the one I had passed just moments before. Entering the alley, it was the same street, the same sign, but this time, the street looked different. The buildings were unfamiliar, and the street was quieter, as if the life had been drained from it. I turned around, hoping to find the alley I had just come from, but there was nothing behind me. The alley had vanished, replaced by the same street, the same buildings, but now they seemed wrong. I felt like I had stepped out of one reality and into another, and everything around me felt distant. And I tried to recall the way back, but nothing made sense. The alley, the street, everything had rearranged itself, and I couldn't find my way back. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the street. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had entered the alley, walked straight down it, and yet somehow I had ended up somewhere else, behind myself, in a place I didn't recognize and couldn't get back from. The more I thought about it, the more the city around me felt like a dream, a fragile thing that could slip away with the slightest shift in perception. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally looked up again, the street was the same as it had always been, ordinary, unchanged, but I knew what I had felt. I knew the alley had shifted, and deep down I understood that the next time I tried to walk down that street, I might find myself lost again, trapped in a place where the rules of the world no longer made sense, and so I walked away, not looking back, because I knew somehow that I would never quite feel like I belonged in that alley again. It was late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an amber glow across the city. The streets were quieter than usual. Most people either already home or still at work. I was walking through the familiar downtown area, trying to keep myself occupied as I waited for the bus to take me back home. The cool breeze carried the faint scent of the nearby coffee shops mixed with the dampness from the earlier rain. I wasn't in a hurry, just lost in my thoughts, walking aimlessly, like I often did when I had time to spare. I'd been down this particular street 1,000 times before, so I didn't think twice when I'd passed the old bookstore on the corner. The shop had been there forever, with the same crooked sign swinging in the breeze, and the window cluttered with second-hand books. I'd never been inside, but something about the place had always intrigued me. It was a reminder of another time, a quieter time, before everything became so noisy. I kept walking, my feet moving on autopilot, when I suddenly heard someone call out behind me. I turned and saw her standing at the corner near the bookstore. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with dark hair and a calm, serene expression. She was wearing a soft, oversized sweater, and seemed completely at ease, as though she belonged here in this moment, in this city. Her gaze met mine, and for a moment I was struck by how normal she seemed, how out of place she was in the strange little memory I felt like I had of her. Without thinking, I nodded in her direction, acknowledging her presence. She smiled at me, a slow, almost knowing smile, and then she gestured toward the street sign just a few feet away. It was the kind of gesture you make when you're about to explain something trivial, like showing someone the way to the nearest cafe. Nothing unusual about it. At first I followed her gaze toward the sign. It was one of those standard street signs, just a simple metal plate with the name of the street embossed in black letters, the kind of thing you pass by without a second thought. But as I looked at it, something happened. I swear I saw the letters move. The name of the street shifted, rearranging itself in front of my eyes, as if the letters were sliding, folding, twisting into different configurations. At first I thought I was imagining things. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a momentary lapse in my focus. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but it was still happening. The letters on the sign began to dance, sliding smoothly across the metal surface, forming new words that made no sense. The original name of the street was barely recognizable. I watched, rooted to the spot, as the letters formed something like Tismage, then Gemtis, then finally settled on Stimaga. None of it was real. None of it made sense. My heart skipped a beat. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The street sign was wrong. It was like the world around me was bending, twisting, distorting. My pulse quickened, and I stepped back instinctively, away from the sign, away from whatever was happening. But it was no use. The sign remained just as before, but now it felt alien, a foreign thing in a place I thought I knew. I turned to look at the woman, but she was still smiling, standing perfectly still, as though she had no idea what was happening. Her smile was calm, almost too calm, like she knew a secret that I didn't. "Do you see it?" she asked softly, her voice a mere whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of the distant city. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to answer. The street sign had changed, and she seemed unbothered by it. I glanced back at the sign expecting it to have shifted again, but now it was still the letters fixed once more, in an ordinary pattern Granville Street, but it had changed. I knew it had. I had seen it with my own eyes. I don't understand, I stammered, my voice shaky. What just happened? She didn't respond right away. She simply looked at me, her expression soft as though she were watching me struggle to make sense of what had just occurred. It felt like an eternity before she finally spoke again. Sometimes the world doesn't stay as we remember it, she said, her voice gentle, as if she were trying to comfort me, but I wasn't comforted. I was terrified. Things move, things change, you just have to see it when it happens. I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but my mind was racing. What did she mean? How could something as simple as a street sign shift like that? And why was it happening to me? I turned around, trying to find something familiar, anything to anchor myself back to reality. The familiar shape of the bookstore loomed at the end of the alley, but now it looked different. The windows were darker, almost black, as if the light from the street had been sucked out, leaving only the shadows. The building seemed taller now, stretching into the sky, but it wasn't right. The architecture felt distorted, and I could barely recognize it. I looked back at the woman, but she was gone just like that, as if she had never been there at all. No trace of her, no hint of her presence. The street was empty again, and the only thing I could hear was the faint hum of the city in the distance. The sign in front of me was normal again, Granville Street, just as it had always been. I was sure of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something fundamental. The street had rearranged itself before my eyes. The woman had been there, pointing, smiling, and then disappeared without a trace. I don't know if I imagined it all. I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if I had somehow wandered into a moment where reality bent. But every time I walk past that corner now, I find myself stopping, staring at the street sign, wondering if the letters will move again, and I can't help but wonder if someday I'll see her again. That smile, that knowing look, and the sense that somehow she had shown me something about how the world can shift, rearrange, and change when you're not looking. But I won't ever be able to forget it, because now every time I pass that corner, I know the world can change just like that. And sometimes, when you're not paying attention, it will. It was one of those overcast days where the sky hangs heavy, full of promises of rain that never quite come. The city felt like it was on pause, as if even the streets were waiting for something to happen, something that would break the monotony. I had been wandering aimlessly, as I often did, between errands in search of nothing but a change of scenery. The buildings around me were old but not ancient, a mixture of brick and glass facades that had started to show their age. There was a feeling of familiarity in the air, the kind you get when you walk through a neighborhood you've seen 1,000 times, yet something in the details keeps drawing your attention. It wasn't a new place, but it didn't feel entirely the same. I was heading down a narrow alley between two buildings, one a tall office block with dark windows, the other a worn-down storefront that hadn't seen a customer in years. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. The pavement was cracked, and the walls on either side were covered in faded advertisements that had long since lost their color. It felt like one of those forgotten spaces, a part of the city that didn't quite belong anywhere. I had walked down this alley countless times before, without thinking twice, but on that day something was different. As I walked past the dilapidated storefront, something caught my eye, a door. It was strange, tucked between the two buildings, almost hidden, as if it had always been there, but I had never noticed it wasn't like the regular back door you might expect in an alley. This one was far too ornate, with a faded wooden frame and brass hinges that had long since lost their luster. The door itself was solid, but it looked out of place, almost as though it had been transplanted from another time, another world. I don't know why I felt compelled to approach it. Maybe it was the oddness of it, how it seemed to call out to me in the middle of the alley where no one else was around. I reached out, and almost instinctively turned the handle. The door creaked open with a soft, drawn-out sound that echoed off the alley walls. And I stepped through. At first I thought I had stepped into another part of the city. The ground beneath me was the same cracked concrete, the same gray surroundings. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was wrong. The air was different. It was warmer, softer, but not in a comforting way. It was heavier, more dense, and the smell was strange, not at all like the damp concrete of the alley, but like rich soil, damp leaves, and an unfamiliar sharpness that made my head spin. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked up again, I realized I wasn't in the alley anymore. I was standing in the middle of a forest. The ground beneath me had shifted from concrete to soft, uneven earth. Tall trees surrounded me on all sides, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches twisting high above into a canopy that blocked out the dull light of the overcast sky. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The trees looked like something out of a fairy tale, dark and brooding, with leaves that seemed too dark, too heavy for the air around them. The forest stretched out in all directions, a tangled maze of undergrowth and shadows that seemed to pulse with the life of their own. I turned back to the door, half expecting to see the alley on the other side, but there was nothing. No wall, no concrete, no alley, just a dense mass of trees. Where the door had been, I tried to call out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the forest, as though it couldn't escape. I walked a few steps toward where the door had been, but there was nothing but trees and underbrush. It was as if the world I had known had simply disappeared. A chill ran down my spine, a cold sensation creeping over me despite the warmth of the air. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of hidden park or an illusion, but nothing about this felt ordinary. The forest around me wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, almost oppressive. The trees stood too close together, their trunks crowding in on me, their branches hanging low like they were reaching out, waiting. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth, of moss and something else I couldn't identify. It felt ancient, as though I had stumbled into a place where time had stopped moving long ago. I took a few more steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was still, but it was too still. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no sound of birds or insects. It felt as though the very air had been stilled, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was unnervingly quiet, the silence pressing against my ears, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I walked deeper into the forest, my feet crunching softly against the undergrowth. The trees seemed to grow denser the further I went, the shadows deepening. As I moved, I tried to focus on the path ahead of me, but everything felt wrong. The shadows seemed to move, flicker at the edges of my vision, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching me from the darkness between the trees. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in around me. The air was heavier now, almost suffocating, and I could feel a creeping unease building in my chest. It wasn't just the eeriness of the place, it was the sense of being lost, of having wandered into a place that wasn't meant to be found. The path ahead of me seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no end in sight. I turned back, hoping to see the door again, but all I saw were more trees, more shadows, more darkness. I started to walk faster, almost running as though the forest itself was chasing me, but the further I went, the longer the path seemed to stretch. I looked back again, expecting to see the door at least, but it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I couldn't tell if I had walked for minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself in that place. My breath came faster now, panic rising in my chest as I pushed forward through the underbrush, and then I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to focus on. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The air around me had become thick with the scent of earth and decay, and I could hear a low rustling in the undergrowth, as if something was moving just beyond my sight. I turned again, desperately searching for the door, the alley, anything that could pull me back to reality, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. How had I gotten here? How had a door in an alley led me to this, and why couldn't I leave? I don't know how long I stood there paralyzed, waiting for something to change, but it never did. The trees closed in around me, the shadows deepened, and I realized that the forest wasn't just surrounding me, it was consuming me, and in the silence I understood I wasn't meant to leave, not ever. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the weather was surprisingly pleasant for the time of year, crisp, with the faintest hint of autumn in the air. I had been spending a lot of my weekends outdoors lately, trying to reconnect with nature after months of being stuck indoors. The quiet hum of city life felt distant, almost irrelevant out here. I had heard about a small picturesque bridge in the nearby woods, not far from where I lived, and decided to explore. A peaceful walk in the woods seemed like a good way to clear my mind. The bridge was about a half-hour's walk from the edge of the forest, a simple wooden structure. I had seen pictures of it before, but something about seeing it in person, standing there with its sturdy arched frame, made it feel different, more alive. The woods around it were dense, the trees standing tall, their leaves just beginning to change color. It was the kind of place that felt suspended in time, untouched by the modern world, the kind of place you could walk through and lose yourself in. As I approached the bridge, the sunlight filtered through the branches overhead, casting dappled patterns on the wooden planks. The bridge itself looked normal. It was old, certainly, but well maintained. There were no broken boards, no rotting timbers. It looked sturdy and inviting, as though it had been waiting for me to cross. I stepped onto it without much thought, the sound of my footsteps muted by the thick air and the rustle of leaves around me. The forest was quiet. Aside from the occasional chirp of a bird or the faint rustle of a squirrel darting between trees, it was peaceful. I reached the middle of the bridge, pausing to lean over the railing and look down. That was when I felt the first strange twinge in my chest. I had expected to see the usual river below, the kind of gentle, winding stream you often find in forests like this, but instead I was met with nothing. There was no water, there was no river, there was nothing at all. The space beneath the bridge simply dropped away into a vast, endless void. The ground was there, yes, but it stretched out far beyond, where I could see, as though the world below the bridge simply didn't exist. No distant trees, no earth, no water, just a sharp, infinite drop that gave me a brief, nauseous sense of vertigo. I stepped back from the railing, heart hammering. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and leaned forward again, half expecting to see the river magically reappear, but it was still gone. The strange emptiness below was so deep, so vast, that it seemed to suck in all the light, all the color, all the sounds. The trees around the bridge were the only things that seemed solid. Everything else felt wrong, like it didn't belong. For a moment I thought it might Be some sort of trick of perspective, like the bridge was part of an optical illusion. Maybe the forest around it had shifted the way I was seeing things. But as I stood there staring down at the gap beneath me, I realized that the longer I looked, the harder it was to even see the far edges of that void. It was like looking into the depths of the sky, into the endlessness that you can't quite grasp. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I shook my head, willing myself to focus, to dismiss the unsettling feeling building in my chest. Maybe I was just tired. I hadn't had much sleep lately. But as I started to take a step back toward the other side of the bridge, I noticed something else. The air around me was different. It wasn't just the quiet or the way the trees seemed to loom a little too close. It was the smell. There was a faint, musty odor lingering in the air, like something old, like something forgotten. It smelled like decay, not the smell of earth or leaves, but something more unsettling, something unnatural. I turned around, glancing behind me, expecting to see the same peaceful trail I had walked in on, but the path seemed to have shifted to it. Wasn't the same trail anymore. The trees were closer now, their branches hanging lower, almost as if they had crowded in, enclosing the bridge. The ground beneath me felt uneven, as if the earth itself had shifted. There was no sound anymore, no birds, no wind rustling the leaves. The world had become a heavy, breathless silence. I stepped off the bridge, my feet moving almost of their own accord back toward the forest path. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed while I wasn't looking. The trees on either side seemed darker now, their branches twisted in unnatural angles, like they were reaching toward me. I glanced back at the bridge, and for a split second I could have sworn the space beneath it was moving. Void, the emptiness, it seemed to pulse, like it was alive, breathing. Waiting, I quickened my pace, not daring to look back again. The path ahead of me was long and winding, the forest growing denser, the trees growing taller, as though they were closing in on me. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of my own footsteps, strangely loud in the thick silence of the woods. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the deeper I walked, the more I could feel something, someone watching me. I felt it in the way the air had thickened, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. I looked behind me once more, and there it was again. The bridge, but it was different. The wooden planks were now warped, leaning to the side, as though they had aged years in the span of moments. The railing had splintered its once solid structure, now twisted and broken. And the void below it was gone. The space was filled, but with nothing, just an unbroken darkness that seemed to swallow the bridge whole. I turned away quickly, and kept walking, trying to keep my mind focused on the path in front of me. I don't know how far I walked, but I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying not to think about the bridge, trying not to think about the emptiness beneath it. I knew I couldn't go back, not to that place, not to that strange hollow stretch of road that seemed to lead nowhere. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, the sky was beginning to darken. I didn't look back, not even once, but sometimes in the quiet moments at night when I close my eyes, I still see it, the bridge and the empty space beneath it, stretching out into nothing, the bridge that didn't belong. And I wonder, if I went back, would it still be there waiting? Would I find the same bridge, the same emptiness, or would it be something else entirely? I don't think I want to know. I had never meant to walk that far. It was meant to be just a quick stroll, a way to clear my mind. I had been cooped up inside all day, glued to my laptop, with rain tapping gently against the window. The kind of rain that makes you feel trapped, but also gives you that small, fleeting sense of peace. So when I finally decided to leave the apartment, I thought a short walk would help me. regain some clarity, maybe get a breath of fresh air to shake off the weight of my thoughts I didn't plan on anything happening. Certainly not what followed. I stepped out onto the street, pulling my coat tighter around me as the cool breeze brushed past my face. The pavement was slick with rain, the darkened streetlights reflecting off the wet surface, casting a dull, almost eerie glow over everything. It was the kind of night where everything feels muted, as though the world around you is asleep, just waiting for you to wake it up. I walked along the familiar path, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty street, each one seeming to linger a little longer in the silence. As I walked, I noticed her ahead of me. She appeared out of nowhere, really. I hadn't seen her coming, but there she was, walking just a few paces ahead of me, barely visible in the dim light. She was wearing a long coat, the hood pulled up to cover her face, which was hidden in shadow. There was something strange about her, something I couldn't put my finger on. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a certain fluidity to them, as though she wasn't quite moving like everyone else. Her steps seemed to glide, almost like she was floating, and it made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite explain why. I picked up my pace, thinking I could pass her easily, but as I did, I realized something. The path ahead of us didn't seem to be getting any shorter. I had walked this way many times before, and I knew it well. The street should have ended at the corner with the park just ahead, but somehow it seemed as though the road kept stretching longer than it ever should. The more I walked, the further away the corner seemed to be, as if the street itself had extended, pulling itself out of reach. I looked ahead, hoping to catch a glimpse of the end of the road, but there was no end in sight. Just the woman in front of me, her figure still just barely visible in the distance, her coat swaying with each step like a silhouette fading into the mist. I tried to shake off the unease that crept into my chest. Maybe it was just the rain playing tricks on me, the fog distorting my sense of space, but as I kept walking, the path continued to stretch. The buildings along the side of the street had started to blur together, their outlines indistinct, as though they were made of smoke rather than brick and glass. The streetlights flickered, their warm glow turning cold and distant. I tried calling out to her, but my voice felt too small in the thick, damp air. It was as though the rain itself was muffling everything, swallowing up every sound before it could leave my lips. I took another step forward, and the distance between us hadn't changed. She was still ahead, moving with that slow, rhythmic grace, and the road stretched endlessly before me. At that moment I should have turned back. The street should have ended right there, but I didn't. Something held me to that path, something deep inside, as though I had no other choice but to follow her. I quickened my pace again, now desperate to reach the corner, desperate to see the end of the street. But with each step I took, the road stretched further. The buildings on either side seemed to fold in on themselves, growing taller and thinner, until they were just shadows looming overhead. I felt my breath quicken, my heart racing, and still I couldn't get closer to her. My legs were growing heavy, the rain colder now, but my mind refused to acknowledge the panic rising within me. Every step I took made the distance between us feel wider, the street longer, the world around me more distorted. The sky had grown darker, and the shadows lengthened, twisting unnaturally as though they were following us, mirroring our every move. I looked back for a moment, but the street behind me was gone. There was no corner, no sidewalk, no familiar landmarks to trace my steps back. I was stuck on a road that didn't exist, walking in a world that was shifting around me, where time and distance had lost all meaning. I called out again, this time louder, my voice rasping in the wet air. But she didn't respond. She didn't even turn to look at me. She just kept walking, her steps as smooth and steady as before. Her figure just a shadow in the distance seemed almost unreal. There was no emotion in the way she moved, no sense of urgency. She was simply walking as though she was part of the landscape itself, as though she had always been there. By now my mind was starting to crack under the strain of what was happening. I couldn't make sense of it. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt thick and heavy, like I was walking through a dream that wouldn't let go of me. The street had become an endless loop, and no matter how far I walked, I could never seem to get any closer to her. I paused again, trying to steady my breathing. My legs were aching, my feet soaked and cold, but there was no escape. I felt as if I was trapped in this place, in this moment, unable to reach the end of the path. Every step I took seemed to stretch the road further, until the distance between us felt like an eternity. At that point, I stopped entirely. My chest heaved with each breath, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't catch. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I was standing there frozen, watching her. She was still there, her form still indistinct in the distance, but there was something different now. The way she walked had changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice her movements were no longer graceful. They were jerky, almost mechanical, like something was wrong, like something had broken inside her. And that's when I realized she wasn't walking ahead of me anymore. She was walking toward me. The realization hit me like a wave. I felt my stomach churn, my skin go cold. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was coming closer slowly, but with each step she took, the distance between us closed, but the path still stretched. No matter how much closer she got, the road seemed endless. The air grew heavier with each passing second, as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as she was almost in front of me, she stopped. Her figure was now so close that I could make out the faintest details of her face, but her eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of her hood. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The street was silent now, the air suffocatingly still. She didn't move, she didn't speak, but I could feel her presence pressing against me, suffocating me. And that's when I realized she had never been walking ahead of me. She had always been waiting for me to catch up. It happened on one of those evenings when the city feels quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe you, but instead makes you aware of how alone you really are. The rain had been falling all afternoon, steady and soft, coating the streets in a reflective sheen. Streetlights flickered faintly above me, their yellow glow trembling in puddles. My shoes were damp, my coat heavy from the moisture, and the cold had begun to seep through my sleeves. I remember thinking how familiar everything felt. This street, this corner, even the faint smell of wet concrete mixed with car exhaust. I had walked this route home countless times before. My apartment was only a few blocks away. I knew the path by heart, even in the rain. When I reached the crosswalk at the end of the street, the pedestrian signal clicked from red to green. I looked both ways, an old habit, and stepped off the curb. The crosswalk seemed longer than usual, stretched wider somehow, though I told myself it was just my imagination. My footsteps echoed strangely on the wet pavement, each one sharper and clearer than it should have been, like the sound wasn't bouncing off the buildings, but coming back from somewhere deeper. I could feel the drizzle on the back of my neck, but it was lighter now, like mist. When I reached the other side, I paused. For a moment I thought maybe I'd walked farther than I'd intended. The street was the same width, the same markings, but the sidewalk here felt wrong. The buildings were taller, not by much but enough to make the sky seem narrower. The windows were darker, and the signs over the shops were faded or in languages I didn't recognize. A faint smell of damp wood and iron hung in the air. I turned to glance back at the crosswalk. It looked the same as before, same stripes, same blinking green man. Cars idled at the light as they always did, nothing had changed. And yet I couldn't shake the sense that the place I'd come from wasn't there anymore, or at least not in the way I had left it. I started walking, thinking maybe I'd just taken a different route by mistake. But the further I went, the stranger it became. The lampposts here were older wrought iron instead of steel, and the benches on the sidewalk were carved wood instead of metal. There were no people. The usual hum of evening traffic, voices and footsteps was gone. All I heard was the faint patter of rain and the occasional hiss of water dripping from a gutter. I reached the next intersection and saw another crosswalk ahead. I thought, if I just cross back, it'll all make sense. It'll be back on the same side, the same world. The pedestrian signal clicked green again. I stepped onto the stripes, each footstep feeling heavier than the last, as though the painted lines were slightly softer than the surrounding asphalt halfway across. I felt a low vibration through my shoes, like the street itself was humming. It wasn't loud, just a subtle tremor that resonated in my bones. I glanced at the cars lined up at the light. Their outlines wavered, almost like reflections in a puddle disturbed by rain. When I stepped onto the opposite curb, my stomach dropped. This wasn't the side I'd left from either. The buildings here were older still, their facades crumbling, ivy creeping across doorways, windows covered with wooden shutters. The street behind me was narrower now, the painted crosswalk faded and cracked. A single street lamp flickered above, casting a weak glow that barely reached the sidewalk. I turned around, thinking maybe I'd gone in a circle, but the street I'd just crossed was gone. In its place was a row of tightly packed houses with dark windows and steep roofs, like something from another century. The drizzle had stopped, but the air felt heavier, thick with the smell of wet stone. I walked faster, trying to find a landmark, something familiar, but everything looked alien. The street names were gone, the signs blank, even the sky had shifted darker now, though I couldn't tell if it was night or just clouds. I stopped at another crosswalk. This one had no signal, no painted lines. Just two stones laid across the wet street. I hesitated, but the silence behind me felt like it was pressing closer, and so I stepped across again. This time the street was cobblestone. Gas lamps lined the sidewalk. There were no cars, only a single dark carriage far down the road, unmoving. The air smelled of smoke and something sweet like burnt sugar. My hands trembled as I clutched the strap of my bag. I didn't know how many streets I had crossed, or how long I had been walking. Each time I crossed, I ended up somewhere older, stranger, emptier. The buildings shifted, the sky deepened, and the world behind me disappeared as though it had never existed. And then in one of the windows above me I saw someone watching, a pale face, unmoving, staring down at me. I blinked, and the face was gone. The window was empty, just glass reflecting the faint glow of the lamps. I crossed again. The street was now just dirt, the buildings wooden frames, leaning like tired skeletons. There were no lamps, no light, except the faint glow of the sky. I turned in circles, the world around me utterly silent. Even the rain had stopped. I don't remember how long I stood there, afraid to take another step. I knew that every time I crossed, I moved further away from where I had started, and yet I couldn't stop. Behind me, there was nothing familiar anymore. Ahead of me, only another street, another crossing. I've been walking for what feels like hours. Each street older, each crossing thinner, the ground softer, the air colder. I don't know where I am now. There are no streets anymore, just a path of pale stones leading off into the mist. But somewhere far behind me, or maybe ahead, I can still hear the faint echo of cars on wet asphalt, like a memory of the world I started in. And sometimes just before I step onto the next crossing, I swear I see my own figure on the other side waiting for me, waiting to cross back, but I don't know if there is a back anymore. And the road keeps going.